Okay, we are recording now. It's lovely to see you all here this evening. We are so fortunate to be joined by Adam Ingersoll, who I think I've known for like almost 20 years, which is crazy. Um,
Longer.
so Adam is the founder and principal at Compass Test Prep. He began his career in test prep back in 1993 at USC, where he was a student athlete and worked in the admission office. Over the last 2 decades, he has guided thousands of families to successful experiences with standardized tests. He is known nationally as a leading expert on college admission testing and is a frequent presenter at higher ed conferences, faculty development workshops, and school seminars. It's been fun for me to catch up with Adam for the last 10 minutes just as we were waiting to start this call. It's been so great. Adam, thank you so much for being here. I am going to turn the call over to you. I will also moderate the chat so that the questions come to me if that works for you, Adam, and that way then you don't have to worry about looking at the chat while you're presenting.
Okay, I'll take it away. Thank you, Amy. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you this evening. Thanks for giving up some time to learn about the wonderful, exciting world of standardized testing. Tonight's talk will be fast-paced. There'll be a lot of information that we'll get through, but I will be happy to share my slides with the school. They can then share it with you. And I dropped into the chat a link to our guide to admission testing. That's a 100+ page resource. It's designed to be a comprehensive tool. Anything you could think of about testing, there should be a comprehensive answer in there with all the data. And that lets me this evening focus on the topics I know are the most important and often confusing. So we'll do things that way. Do send through questions as you have them. I think Amy will probably just knock most of them out, but she may save some to elevate for live discussion at the end. And so go ahead and send those questions as you have them. I'm going to share my screen. 1 second. Okay, if I could get a thumbs up that you're now looking at my screen in full view. We are all set. Okay, thanks, Amy. Amy came back on camera just for that. Appreciate it. All right. Well, again, thanks for being here. There's a lot to talk about with testing in a normal year, and these are still not normal years when it comes to testing. Things are still quite complicated and messy, and it's hopefully worth your time to be here to talk about it. I know on the call tonight we have 9th, 10th, and 11th grade families. I think there's more 10th than anything else probably, but know that that's a bit of a challenge because the advice applies differently depending on your stage in the process. And as you've probably heard, if you're a 10th grade family, you are the transition year, the guinea pig, so to speak, for a brand new digital adaptive SAT. So I'll be talking more, of course, about what that will entail. I'm not here tonight to talk about my own company's services. This is what we do and how to reach us. I've been known for doing tutoring in the Bay Area for 30 years. We're not hard to find, and those are some of the things that we offer. I want to say only on this that we do diagnostic exams for free or at a very nominal cost, and we provide feedback, a call, a meeting if you'd like, about those results, not only as a free service, but also just without any pressure whatsoever to enroll in our services. So know that more questions about the tests and so on beyond tonight's meeting, we're available if you'd like to reach us. Okay, I'm under the belief that it's all parents tonight, or primarily parents. So I want to start just a moment with perspective on where we are coming from. And I say we because I'm speaking to you from the perspective of someone who's worked with the tests for decades, but I also will be dispensing some free parenting advice. You get what you pay for, but my qualifications, such as they are, just tens of thousands of families over the years that I've worked with on this process. And I also have 4 kids of my own. We have 4 teenagers, including one who's in her first year of college. So I finally experienced this firsthand, and all the advice I was throwing around for years got put to the test. And I struggled a bit, harder than it looks. But this is a cartoon. I think I came across this 20 years ago, and it was really poignant because if it's hard to see on your screen, you've got an upset student, doesn't want to hear it, and a parent started picking on moms, could just as well be a dad, and its parent is saying, tell me what's bothering you, and use your SAT words while you do. So I think this is an example of, as a parent, our hearts are always in the right place. We're well-intentioned, but sometimes in this process, we can push too hard. Our timing is not right. And this often comes into relief with standardized testing, because I will be the first to tell you, and I'll elaborate on this, there's very much this fine line between giving these tests their due and overdoing them. I think efficiency is really a value you should hold up in how you try to go about coping with the exams. And I could spend tonight's time doing nothing but telling you stories of, over the top bad behavior in this space. And I think tonight my goal would be to try to have you, log off this evening really feeling like you've got a solid contemporary grasp of how the tests are working right now and what you should and shouldn't do to help your student be successful in coping with them. This is the to-do list, also tonight's agenda, and it's basically chronological. And even if you're a ninth grade family, at this point, starting to get your head around these topics and really the nuance of the evolving, and it is still evolving, a role of these tests. On the one hand, I want to say very clearly that broadly speaking, the relevance of the SAT and ACT peaked just over 3 years ago when the pandemic began in this country. And the vast majority of colleges adopted more flexible testing policies or decided to abandon them altogether. Broadly speaking, the relevance of the SAT and ACT will never be what it was. In a particular student's context, it still may be very important or a useful tool, a means to an end, and I'll talk about that. But you have still, I think, a fairly new, novel situation of being able to take all this in, look at the tests, probably at least do some practice tests, and then say, no, thanks. If for your student, there's not reason to believe that the tests are going to be useful. A common situation would be a student whose academic profile, transcript, and activities is just much, much stronger than the testing ever will be. So you take advantage of this new flexibility to forego testing or forego submitting scores. And I completely respect and honor that. One of the things you want to do, though, is not foreclose on that too early and use the practice testing that the school tees up for you and highly recommends to experiment with the tests and then decide ultimately, do you want to go after them aggressively? Do you want to hedge at them kind of modestly? Do you want to forego them altogether? These are some of the questions that ultimately each individual family has to decide. Ideally, you would somehow have perfect information to make that decision. And I'm here to disappoint you. There's going to be a number of topics tonight on which you may be thinking there has to be a correct decision here if only we gather the best information. And I know some of us are in jobs where, the best information wins and, we're scientists and so on. This is bound to frustrate you because it will require speculation on your part as you approach some of these tactical decisions. And all we can do is arm you with the best information that it is available and some perspective on how to think about things. The nuts and bolts of testing are kind of timeless. Which test should I pursue and when, and how will I prepare for it? So number one thing to do is get your student to take the practice tests when they come along, take them seriously so that the results are meaningful. And from those, you really can suss out what's going to be the best test for the student, what are realistic goals, what is the best timeline or least worst timeline to drop this onto their schedule. I take as a fairly safe assumption that families that are going to have the student taking the tests are probably doing some form of preparation, whether it's expensive private tutoring, more affordable classes, something self-prep. All of those forms of prep can be successful, but they do take some commitment on the student's part. And then increasingly, there are tricky questions more towards the end. One is when to walk away from these tests, when to say enough's enough and be done. And the interesting thing about this one is almost everybody has to make this decision before they, without getting to a perfect score. That's the nature of the test, the very few perfect scores in the big picture. So for some students, it's the first time in their life that they intentionally walk away from something academic before they have kind of maxed out what it can theoretically be. And I will be the first to tell you that there are many students who reach a point of diminishing returns where even if they had unlimited time and energy, which they don't, throwing more of that time and resources at this isn't productive. So I hold this up as an example of a decision, a judgment call that we have to make as families. I think it should mostly be the student's decision, but as parents, we're involved. And it's tough. Sometimes it gets the best of us. And even though we know it kind of is what it is, we can't help ourselves and keep pushing the student. And other times we're at our best and the student hears from us, you know what, great job, you're done. I'm proud of you. This is good. Counselor saying enough. Let's move on. Other things in your life, that are more important. I think you should focus on. So that decision point comes for every family, typically late in 11th, early in 12th grade. And then finally, at the end of the process of testing, So fall of 12th grade, almost any college counselor in America could tell you this has been the bane of their existence the last 3 years, is trying to figure out for each school on your list, should you submit the scores that you have? Would they be additive or at worst neutral, or should they be hidden? That is also just a big pain. That is a great example of something that lacks perfect information. So these are some of the things we're going to run through here pretty quickly. First, the lay of the land. So we have tracked for decades a pool of just over 400 US colleges, and they're the ones that you've heard of, the most popular nationally, most selective. I don't mean to suggest the other 2,000 four-year colleges in this country are not also worthy of your interest, but these are the ones that drive the conversation around testing. And here's where they are as of this week. We're constantly updating this slide. And the extremes would be to be test-free. That's, of course, the UCs, the Cal States, Caltech, Reed. It's predominantly a West Coast phenomenon, the intersection of test-free and selective schools, mostly on the West Coast and mostly in California. That, I think, broadly speaking, has been wonderful, full stop, from the perspective of the goals those schools have around equity, diversity, and seeing incoming classes more representative of the state. It's been a good thing. It's been a useful tool to help them attract more students, hopefully enroll more diverse populations. It hasn't been without its complications or drawbacks. One of the things is whether that's quote unquote a good policy depends on where you sit. And if you're a kid who had your goal was always one of the UCs and you have great test scores that now won't be looked at, maybe you're bummed. But big picture, that's been, I think, good policy for the entire system in an environment where there's no perfect policy. The other extreme is to require the test. And this is interesting. You cannot avoid the red state, blue state reality here. There's so few colleges in this group that require the test. I can just name them very quickly. It's the State University System of Florida, at least for now. DeSantis and the College Board are beefing over whether certain APs are too woke. That's as much as I have to say about that. The University of Tennessee, public universities in Tennessee, the state of Georgia, their flagships, UGA and Georgia Tech and Georgia State. And then it's just a handful of others. West Point, Georgetown, of course. If you know anything about testing, Georgetown's always first in line to cheerlead for the tests. And then MIT and Purdue went back to requirement last year. That's it. So I don't think I know anybody on the call tonight, but I can say confidently that without knowing your student, you can create a very exciting, compelling, broad college list without a single school that requires tests of you. And that's really a radical change from where we were just over 3 years ago. So before you, though, leave, log off, the vast middle ground, of course, are colleges that leave it as your choice. And within those, I think it's a mistake to think of test optional as just a binary. I draw a distinction between schools that, for example, in March of 2020, a school that immediately and permanently and enthusiastically went test optional. They were clearly just waiting for the opportunity to convince the faculty to do it, versus a school that dragged their feet for months into the fall of 2020, the real teeth of the pandemic, and then finally reluctantly announced a 1-year suspension of their requirement. On paper, those are both test optional schools, but I think as you're deciding on your own approach to the tests, if the schools like the latter are high on your list, then that would affect what you would do. So this puts you in the position of having to read the tea leaves a bit. And I think it's useful to think of testing policies as being on a spectrum. I talked about requiring the test and ignoring the test. Most colleges are somewhere here in the middle. I want to say too, most of them I would say are in this lower basket where the tests are optimal, nice to have, or lower relevant, or really just an afterthought. That's the majority of the colleges. I don't think the testing is driving a lot of decisions. It's a smaller group where you could fairly say they're expected or preferred, like University of Michigan might be an example. But the problem is you don't go to a school's website and you see the top of the admissions webpage, them labeling their policy using this taxonomy. They use their own language, and sometimes it's hard to get a sense of it. We look at outcomes. We try to tease out the role of testing that way, and feels like a fool's errand sometimes. So how do you approach that question? Well, ideally, there would be compelling and clear data that would inform a decision like this that seems so high stakes. And here again, I'm here to disappoint you. There are data, but they're limited and they're very problematic. So one question that I've heard now, daily for 3 years is, or been talking about is, do the differences in admit rates for the applicants with testing versus without, what story does that tell? Well, it tells a kind of a confusing story. So superficially, you could look at these data and think, okay, a lot of these schools, it appears that the students with testing are much more likely to get in. Not really. By the way, these 24 or so colleges are the only ones we've ever come across the last 3 years that were ever willing to share these data. Most now no longer do. Penn was dismayed to find this was being like dissected, so they stopped. But here's what I would take away from this. So you look at a school like Emory. It's wrong to look at this and think, oh, well, you're more than twice as likely to get into Emory just because you have testing. That's a mistaken, superficial read. It confuses correlation and causation. Any admission officer would tell you that the students who have really strong testing, that they then, of course, voluntarily submit, kind of the rational actor theory, are the students who would have been the strongest candidates usually anyway. And that actually underpins the argument behind test optional policy, which is that in the most, at least a lot of cases, the test scores don't add additional new information. They at most just confirm what was already evident, the transcript and other pieces of the application. So don't let anybody tell you that test optional is a fraud or sham, and these data prove that. I think they're showing, their self-interest perhaps. And know that it's really more of just a correlated relationship. Same time, if I'm applying into these very competitive environments and I have strong competitive test scores I can include, I probably feel a bit better, but don't read it as this is a really simple causal thing. There's been some frustration with test optional. There's no perfect policy in a process that's competitive and messy as selective college admission. Most people, I think, on the admission side are pretty happy with test optional. Not everybody on the other side is. These are just reactions I've seen very recently from people, many of whom are college counselors. One of the frustrations is when there's exceptions to test optional. Another frustration would be when you hear after the fact that you didn't have the test scores, you should have had something else. Another one is when, okay, for admission, you're test optional, but it feels like for getting merit aid, you are not. And then on the right here, this is Melissa Korn, the Wall Street Journal's higher ed reporter, just commenting on what feels like some hypocrisy sometimes. You see a college, crowing about how many more applicants they're getting and how high those test scores are, when all of that is, of course, just fueled by test optional. So you'll see this kind of stuff out there. At the end of the day, I think the reason the tests aren't going away entirely nationally, I think California will in the long term prove to be mostly an outlier in a completely test-free policy, are these data. So this is data from a year and a half into the pandemic. 11th graders who took the PSAT were polled on their grade point average, and about 2/3 of them reported an A average. I lived this with my oldest child, who is now in her first year of college. She and her friends were my little focus group all during the pandemic school years, which colored their entire high school experience. And they were funny kids. They said things like, yeah, we know B is the new D because of COVID. Okay, that was a bit of an exaggeration. But those kids knew, without me having to explain it, what my admissions officer's friends meant by a COVID transcript. That wasn't something that was mysterious to them. These are data more longitudinal, same thing. A's passed B's as the most common grade point average about 5 or 6 years ago, and that's continuing to diverge. So I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting for a second that grades are less important than they are. If you had to name just one piece of an application that's the most important, it's almost always going to be the student's transcript, as it should be. The work they've done day in and day out for years, and hopefully challenging classes, frankly, the reputation of the school, all of that is prominent in the review. But same time, no single piece of the application tells all. And colleges, generally in a competitive environment, the more compelling data points you can provide, the better. And here's what the distribution of test scores look like. this is the ACT national distribution from last year. I could show you SAT or ACT at any point in time going back decades. The distribution is basically the same. It's stable. It has this long tail. So we could debate what a high standardized test score says about a human being. I'd be the first to tell you the long haul, doesn't say a lot, doesn't get at other forms of intelligence, doesn't get at street smarts or effort or communication skills, a sense of humor, the things that as adults we know really matter in the long haul of life, in our relationships, our work, our personal lives. That's easy for a 16-year-old to, not appreciate when they first start getting practice tests back if they're disappointing. So there's a lot we could criticize about the tests, but they do what they do. And the highest grades are the most common in almost every school environment, whereas the highest standardized test scores are the least common. So it's that contrast, that juxtaposition that props up their limited value to colleges that have not abandoned them. This I thought was very candid. This was a group chat I'm on. This was a director mission, a highly selective private university. We're talking about grade data and testing and so on. And that person shared what you see here, just that they also at the college level experienced inevitable grade inflation in the first couple of years of the pandemic, where what could you do but be flexible and empathetic with what everyone was going through. But this, to me, was I was a little bit dismayed, is too strong a word, but I thought, grade inflation at the high school level, at some point that has to get dealt with, or we're just kicking the can to graduate school or kicking the can to the workforce. At the end of the day, I think we do want to make sure that a lot of our, people doing very important jobs, whether it's medicine or something, science or engineering, have met important criteria. So I think there's a role for standardized tests, but I think it's also healthy that in the last several years that role has been reshaped, taken down. I think that's all positive in the biggest of big pictures. There's also some pushback from faculty starting to emerge. Faculty feeling like we're getting more and more students that just aren't quite as prepared as they used to be. This is presenting challenges in the classroom. Where this goes is hard to say. One school I'm watching carefully is Cornell. Cornell's interesting in that it's the only Ivy that is partially test for free. 3 of their 7 colleges are test free like the UCs. The other 4 are test optional. So they're collecting some of the best data in the country. They have those kind of controlled groups. And so far, those 7 colleges all want to keep doing it their own way. And that's a place where the faculty, the individual colleges have a lot of power. I mentioned that one too. My uncle is the vice provost of enrollment and financial aid there. So I get an inside look. And it's a complicated, ongoing study. They are studying this for several more years before they attempt to make a permanent decision. So I think one of the themes here is it might feel like the pandemic 3 years ago is 30 years ago. It's, and the testing stuff has settled. I think it's actually early days. It's kind of the beginning of the end of the beginning of the testing, the new testing world. And what some colleges are saying is, look, they need many more years. They need some distance from the pandemic years to understand really how their changes to their testing policy they implemented 3 years ago are going to play out in a more quote unquote normal environment where their applicants had all 4 years of regular school. These are some of the conversations that are going on. The other thing that's happening is just, it's undeniable that the pandemic, test optional spiked applications, especially to the most high profile schools. This is a really simple statistic that brings that into relief. Yale's pointing out that their number of first year applicants increased 50% since 2020, 3 years ago. And they attribute that largely to their test optional policy. So I think, again, I want to be very clear, full stop. It's good that places like Yale are now attracting a much broader base of applicants. That is good. They're also attracting some applicants, though, who were from their historic sort of feeder environments, but applicants who would have not applied before because their scores weren't competitive, but now thought, why not? But they're not in any way like the new candidates Yale was necessarily seeking. So there's more noise in the funnel, so to speak, would be a way to look at it. Here's some data from a recent report on the common application pool. And what they're finding, again, just more and more students applying to more and more colleges, particularly high scoring students. Some nuggets from that: number of applications per student up 34% from 8 years ago. And it's, again, driven by the applicants to the highly selectives. 250,000 students applied to 10 or more colleges this year through Common App. That's doubled in the last 8 years. This statistic's crazy. The share of students applying to 20 colleges more than quadrupled over that period. It's still a fairly small number overall, but the trend is not good. And the applicants to colleges with low admit rate, highly selective, now apply to more than 12 colleges each on average. So there's just more, I guess I would say, I'm not a useful role, perhaps arguably, of the test 4 years ago was that they provided a way for students to better anticipate what decisions might be. And they were this filter at the top of the funnel, kids saying, well, I'm not going to waste my time here with the scores that I have. Now, it's a mixed bag. With more and more students applying to more and more places, I think the ability to try to anticipate where a student will be admitted is just more and more challenging. That's just a reality. Who are those high volume appliers? They tend to be students looking, again, at highly selective schools. They're 6 times more likely to be applying early decision. 2.5 more times more likely to private schools. 8 times more likely to be submitting testing with their application. They tend to be higher scorers, tend to be from the Northeast or international. Not as much from California anymore, because California is ground zero for test free. So this is the profile of who those kids tend to be. And again, I just give you some perspective as you're, again, trying to figure out for yourself how relevant testing should be, how much concern you should attach to it. It's interesting, Amy, tonight I'm coming to you from New York City, where earlier this evening I was presenting in person for the Parent Association at Bronx Science, incredibly competitive public school here in New York City. And their context is different than yours. They are students who, with some exceptions, basically would not be at that school if they were not very strong testers in the first place because of the requirement to get in. They are in an environment where a lot of the schools are going to be applying to, so are dozens of their classmates, in a few cases even hundreds of their classmates also applying. And so they probably are strong testers. They're probably assumed to be strong testers, and they're applying from a highly competitive environment where almost everybody, really effectively everybody, is testing and probably submitting. So in their situation, applying without testing probably feels like more of a weakness. It might at some schools even be kind of, strike the reader as a little bit unusual. And your situation would be very different. Being at a smaller school and in California, where everybody knows you could build a compelling in-state college list without any scores at all. So context informs everything in this. Let's move on to some brass tacks. So talking about testing timelines, when should students do all of this? Well, historically, a popular approach to timing looked like this: not touching it in 10th grade, fall of 11th grade, finalizing plans with practice tests, fresh practice testing, starting prep sometime late in fall, winter, targeting a spring of 11th grade test date for a first official sitting, which still leaves time that spring of 11th grade for repeat testing. These students would absolutely be okay with, if not be expecting, to have the testing roll over into summer and early fall of 12th grade, which is still not too late for most early decision timelines. And this was fine. So when I first started doing this work, my first students when I was in college were almost all kids. It was a summer before their 12th grade. This timeline is developmentally appropriate still for a majority of students. It waits on the testing until that student is likely closer to being ready to peak. It's more efficient, applies the treatment of test prep when they've gotten more academic development under their belt. So it's perfectly sensible. But this has fallen out of favor. This is no longer, has not been for 15 years, the most popular timeline framework in my own practice. We work with thousands of families all over the country, but primarily from very competitive environments. And it's hard to get someone to wait anymore, even when it's clearly a good idea. This more aggressive timeline has become very, very common, and I have mixed feelings about it. It's characterized by hopefully not starting the actual prep in 10th grade, holding off on that unless there's some really specific rationale. But it's definitely locking in planning with practice tests in 10th grade. I think that's okay. The practice testing early is usually fine. These families are then usually doing intensive prep the summer before 11th grade. That can make sense. What if the student is behind it? It's not that just the parents driving it. Typically makes more sense when the student is higher scoring, pretty strong academically, has the likelihood of getting peak scores earlier. But the problem with it is there are many students who don't fit that profile, but kind of follow the herd anyway. And even the students for whom it's reasonably appropriate, the concern is that because you did a lot of prep that summer, you feel like I've got to go after one of these beginning of the school year official test dates in August or September, and I want to try to peak the first time, be one and done. And that is very unlikely. The data tell us there are very few students who peak that early in 11th grade and never test again. And the worst thing you could do would be to get the 11th grade year off to a weak start academically because you were too mired and concerned for the test. That is really just, imbalanced priorities. So if you're doing this, know why you're doing it and make sure it's appropriate. It's also driven by a desire to be done with testing altogether by spring of 11th grade. And I get it. That's nice if it's realistic. But for students for whom it's not realistic or not necessary, sometimes the effort to do it backfires. The worst case scenario is the student just gets totally burned out and frustrated early and interferes with their schoolwork, all just counterproductive. So if you can wait, the idea is that you time the treatment of test prep when the student is closer to peaking developmentally, academically anyway. And I can't tell you what timeline's best for you without a broader conversation, but in general, I would just offer that efficiency should be one of your values as you figure out how to go about this. And for some students, it's more efficient if more of it is pushed a bit later. This other way of going about it meets a lot of our clients where they are. It's kind of a nice compromise. Practice testing still by the end of 10th grade. Doing some modest amount of prep to get a running start over the summer before 11th grade, if it seems appropriate. Lay the groundwork, kind of address any weaknesses, get a good working relationship going with the tutor that's going to stick with you, but not overdoing it, not taking the test officially in August or September, maybe for the first time November or December. Maybe be done by the end of 11th grade, but be open to it rolling into the summer before 12th if necessary. I think this is a healthy but also appropriately competitive posture as well. So there's different ideas here, but make your timeline your own for the right reasons would be what I would encourage. Okay, your choices. This is a new slide for this year because in a transition year with a brand new test, some students have different options. If you're an 11th grade family, this is straightforward. You're choosing between the paper forms of the SAT and the ACT. Unless, Amy, I heard of this week, a student who was a US student who was flown overseas to take the first debut of the digital SAT. I want to say it was in South Korea, which was insane. There's no reason to do that. The rationale for it was really convoluted, made no sense. But anyway, if you're an 11th grader staying in the US, paper versions of these tests are your only options. The current 10th graders, the class of 25, they're the ones who will be the transition year. So let's talk about the options from an 11th grader's perspective. You could, row one, say no thanks to all of this. And I've tried to honor that choice. That can absolutely be appropriate. Line two would be kind of the safe harbor thing, or saying I'm going to kind of go with everybody that the flight to the familiar during a period of change. ACT is stable. Every single test state will be offering the same test. It can be hard to find ACT test sites in California, especially the Bay Area sometimes. But the universe of prep material for that, even an individual tutor who's not very experienced should know what they're doing with it. That's its pluses. It's not for everybody though. The digital SAT, I'll bounce down to line 4. As I'll show you in a minute, there are many students who, as soon as they find out the digital SAT is about an hour shorter and has no long reading passages at all. I've had this in presentations with kids already. So let me stop you right there. I'm good. That's the one I'll go with. Why would I, not take the path of least resistance, so to speak? Well, there can be reasons why it's not the right fit, and I'll get to that here in a moment. The paper SAT, row 3, the problem with that one is it puts you on a timeline where you're trying to peak by December of 11th grade, because that's the last time it will ever be offered. And I just would not go out of my way to push a student to choose an option that pushes them to peak that early. I talked about why that can be problematic. Now, we're going to have some students pursuing it. They are students who have taken the battery of practice tests. I think your school, you're going to be doing the paper SAT, I think this coming weekend. And it proved to be the best fit out of these 3. And the student was probably higher scoring, so there was some reason to hope that a peak by December is realistic. But that I'm describing a minority, small minority of students. That should not be the leading candidate for most students. The digital, you have to wait till March of next year, but I think that's kind of a feature more than a bug. So it's a viable option, and it's really a test College Board has built to be more desirable from students' perspective. 9th graders, the paper SAT will be gone, and you'll be choosing between ACT or the digital SAT. ACT is racing to also get to the digital front here. They already have a digital test that's just a basic linear, it's like a PDF on screen. What they will do, their digital future remains to be seen. But if you're a 9th grade family, quite possible ACT has made a move by the time you're coming through the process. Let's talk for a minute about which test to take. And I would just warn you to be aware of the advice that sounds clever, but is not coming from an expert per se. You hear a lot of things like a student who's a certain type of learner or certain academic strengths or has a learning difference is better at this test or that test. None of that holds water. Practice tests routinely debunk that, these assumptions. So the advice is always going to be the same. Take the practice tests to see for sure which one the student should pursue. And I should be clear that not a single college in the country is extra impressed by a great score on more than one of the tests. You just need one or the other at most. So it's worth your while to go through a careful exercise to help the student at the beginning of the process. So by fall of 11th grade at the latest, through practice tests, have locked in the tests that they're going to pursue and for the right reasons. When you take those practice tests, here's a tool you can use to compare the scores. Our score report has this integrated. It's also in the handout that I linked to in the chat at the beginning. The way it works is it's like a grid. Say you had a practice ACT of 22 and a practice SAT of 1200. You would see where these scores intersect on the chart. And that student's a better SAT taker. That's the test to pursue all day long. So it's kind of nice when it's that cut and dry as to which test they should go after. Another scenario, quite common, might be a student who, let's say, has a practice ACT of 31 and a practice SAT of 1400. Great. The student's not going to need a lot of prep. It's not going to be a heavy lift. Well, these scores, though, are a tie as far as colleges are concerned. They're considered equivalent. So when this happens, and it's quite common, it's really worth the student's while to break down what's inside the reports, really try to arrive at what's going to be the best fit for that student. It's an exercise in speculating on which of the tests does the student have the higher ceiling. Sometimes that's obvious. It also gets into the weeds. What would be required of the student on this test versus that test? And what do they want to do? What would they be working on? What's the theory of the case? What would it take to raise the score to the maximum amount? It is worth thinking this through up front, because I want you to avoid the situation where it's end of 11th grade and you realize that, the student would have been better off on a different test and now you're switching, and that's just inefficient. I would also tell you, beware of the too cute tutoring companies that offer packages for more than one test. Every time the SAT changes, there's a transition year where that class has 3 options, and there's somebody that rolls out the triple platinum package for all 3 tests. They're just showing their ethics. That's in their interest, not yours. Again, you just need one test or the other. So try to approach it with efficiency as a goal. Here are the 2 paper exams at a high level. So students at Marin Academy in 10th grade took a practice ACT recently and are taking a practice SAT on paper shortly. This is what they are doing and how the tests compare. At a high level, what the tests have in common is they're just exhausting. High stakes, stressful 3+ hour tests in their current form. A lot of students, the anxiety, just the fatigue shows up in the results, especially when they're just in 10th grade. Also at a high level, academically, the content, there's a lot in common, enough so that colleges don't have a preference for one over the other. The differences are in the details, and they add up to significance for students trying to make a decision between the exams. I'll give you a few examples. Reading comprehension's on both tests. You can't get away from it. You've got to do it. But the SAT, it's the first section. So it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and you've shown up on a weekend to take a test. You're stressed, you're tired, trying to wake up. The first thing you have to do is the longest of any of the sections, 65 minutes, all reading comp, go. Now, if you have extended time due to a learning difference, great, an hour and 38 minutes of reading to start your day. Wonderful. Well, the upside and positive is that most students report the pace is okay. You have more than a minute per question, but it can be boring. It's hard to stay focused. ACT, of course, also has reading comprehension, but it comes up 2 hours into the test. It's much shorter, 35 minutes. That's a big difference in the amount of time, but there's always going to be a trade-off here. In this case, it's that it's faster paced, less than a minute per question. You've got to really be hustling to get through the ACT sections on time. So this comes down to a detailed list of pros and cons, and then a kind of a pick your poison situation. You know, what seems least worst in some cases in terms of what you have to contend with. Both tests have English. SAT calls it writing and language. And a lot of this is more reading comprehension, but now you're being more of an editor. ACT, look at the structure here. First section of the day, 8 o'clock in the morning, 75 questions in just 45 minutes. Really fast paced. This is a theme of the ACT. With one exception, ACT feels like the more speeded test for most students. Don't be dismayed if a 10th grader had a hard time finishing a section or two of the ACT. That is pretty common and can often, easily be corrected. But one of the ways you improve ACT scores is drill and kill. You just get faster and faster through repetition and practice. And some students that feels very straightforward. Other students, it just stresses them out. So try to figure out all of this. ACT has a science section, which is a bit of a misnomer. It's at the end of the test. There's not many questions where remembering things from science classes at school makes a difference. It's really in many ways more of a reading comprehension exercise, more technical material. It's also a quantitative element. There'll be charts and graphs, tables of data. You do a little bit of lightweight math, but it's to a large extent reading comp. So the struggle students have with it, it's at the end of the section when they're exhausted. It is a format that's unfamiliar, and it's just really dense. 35 minutes to do 6 passages and 40 questions. It is the most common section on which students struggle to finish in time. So I would tell you, though, if your score report profile that you're looking at, the math and the reading are significantly higher than the science, that's usually a profile from which you can see a lot of quick improvement on science. Basically, the skills are there. The student needs to learn the format and get comfortable with the pace. So that's pretty straightforward. Ultimately, though, if a student just really, really despises the science, then the SAT may be the test for them. It doesn't have a discrete science section. Last but not least, the math. ACT math, straightforward, 60 minutes, 60 questions, all multiple choice. What you see is what you get. Very formulaic. It covers a lot of ground in math. As an example, about a third of the ACT math is geometry. Whereas on the SAT, geometry is an afterthought. So in our conversations, we're always bringing up, okay, when was geometry? How did it go? Do you want to review it? Would you want to avoid it? And we factor that into the discussion. SAT math is quirky. There's 2 sections. The one at the end is the longer one, which allows a calculator. Before that, though, there's a short, quick hitting math section on the paper SAT with calculator not allowed. And it's very fast paced, 25 minutes, 20 questions. This is the SAT, current SAT paper, SAT math section where kids often run out of time. If they bounce back on the following section, that usually reflects just need to work on pace, become less calculator dependent perhaps. But that's the structure. One final thing on this slide before I move on is think of the big picture here. Imagine 2 things about a student are true. Let's say that they struggle with just keeping up their energy focus on a long, high stakes, intimidating test. And let's also say that math's their weakness. Math's not their favorite. The student I just described, the SAT structure can be a double whammy because half of the score on an SAT is math. So that's, what's not your strength. And math is the entire second half of the exam when you're getting tired. So students for whom math is a strength sometimes take an extra long look at the ACT where math is just 1/4 of the score out of 36 and math comes up in the first half of the test. Even the sequence of the material is something we look at how it plays out for a particular student. Okay, the digital SAT, it is coming. And unlike previous changes to the test, this one is going to be on schedule. It's already debuted outside of the US last month, and it went smoothly, actually. 50,000 students took it, and it was fine. For your 10th grade class, it debuts in the form of the PSAT, which you don't do, and then the March SAT 11 months from now. 2 and 3 are the headlines for a lot of students. As I mentioned, almost an hour shorter, only short reading passages that I'll show you in a second. A lot of kids say that's what I'll do. Your challenge here, our collective challenge, my company, college counselors, parents, is for students for whom the ACT might be a bit more taxing, but presents more upside. We've got to get students to, take your medicine, eat your broccoli, do what's good for you, and it's not what you want to do. But that's going to be a bit of a tough sell for students who look at both and like, why do I have to do the longer test? It's just, annoying. The digital SAT no longer will have a no calculator math section. Calculator allowed on all the math. It's taken on a computer or a tablet, it's device agnostic. Number 6 is a source of some confusion. I'm going to explain this carefully. Yes, it's adaptive. So part of it, the difficulty varies based on the first part. That can seem scary and intimidating. It doesn't need to be. It's still taken out at school, not at home. It's scored out of 1600, the same scale. College Board is arguing that this is not a pedagogical change to the test. It's just a format. So they're arguing that longitudinally can compare these scores, no problem. We think that colleges that currently super score the SAT, where they mix and match math and verbal across test dates, we think that in this upcoming year, they will super score across digital and paper, but very few have articulated that yet. Ultimately, there's no reason for them not to, unless they're just irritated with the College Board and don't want to play along. We'll see what happens. Number 9, one of the rationales for the redesign going digital was digital is much more secure. You can look at the screen of the student next to you and it won't help you. They have their own dynamically selected bank of problems. And the number 10 is in the weeds, but I want to make sure there's not misinformation about it. The new scoring means that different questions can be worth different weight. That seems like it's a big deal. It actually is not actionable. It's not something you can do anything with it. All right, structure. On the verbal side, the digital SAT is the shortest, 64 minutes, far fewer questions. An adaptive test where it's customizing the difficulty of the second half based on the first half lets the test zoom in on your score on the 800 scale more efficiently. It doesn't waste your time with easy questions that don't inform your score, or vice versa, hard questions. It does mean that ultimately then the digital SAT, you're getting twice as much time per question on the verbal as you are on parts of the ACT verbal. Far more questions, 115 at ACT English and Reading compared to the digital SAT. Here's an example of the new digital SAT's short reading passages. This was it for reading on the SAT. They're bite-sized questions. They're also not cumulative. Every question is its own island. For a lot of students, this feels more approachable. It doesn't automatically mean it's easier. You can write very hard questions with short passages, and there are some students who will do better with a more complete narrative, with more details to nuance, context to sink their teeth into and go find the answers. But it's undeniable that if I'm a kid and I can choose from these passages, or here's a typical ACT long passage, it's a lot. So we're going to see what students do here. I don't know if you're a fan of the old Parks and Rec show. Thought this was an appropriate meme. What I've seen from kids when you hit them with one of these long passages after another on the ACT, it's just really, really kind of labored. But some kids, again, are going to be better off with long passages. We just have to get them to then deal with it. You have to place the ACT science somewhere in the comparison. It's this outlier. I put it with verbal. It's more reading than anything. And now these differences in the experience are really, really stark. So 115 minutes, almost twice as much time, almost 3 times as many questions on the paper ACT than on the digital SAT. And those questions come from 15 long passages. So I get it. Students are going to be reluctant in some cases. Here's the math. Here, the differences aren't quite as severe. The digital SAT is actually longer, 70 minutes on the math, than the paper ACT. but it actually doesn't feel as long because it's broken up into 2 sections and it's far, far fewer questions. ACT has more than a third more questions than the digital SAT on the math. So that nets out to 60% more time per question on the digital SAT. So the feel of it, the pace is just really, really different. How does it play out in your scores is what we're going to be concerned about with the practice test results. Here's what we're talking about. We're going from a static paper, linear paper exam, you're familiar with those, to a multi-stage adaptive exam. Now, digital adaptive exams have been the norm for decades with graduate school admission tests. So this is really nothing new. It's why it's going smoothly so far for the College Board. Here's how it works. You can have your own computer or one provided by school. It's device agnostic. You install the College Board's Blue Book app, ideally in advance, so that's done. And you get to the test center, you get checked in, signed in, and then you download your encrypted question modules. Every student gets a first module for verbal and math. That's the same blended difficulty for everybody. But you also have 2 second modules. And which one you will get depends on how you do on the first. One is predominantly skews easier, one skews harder. Here's what they look like. So again, a first module, same blended difficulty for everybody, it's balanced. But then you go on the easier path with more of a concentration of easy questions, or the hard path, more of a concentration of hard questions. This, of course, wouldn't exist if it weren't consequential. So what's going on? Well, imagine 2 students. On the left side of the slide here, we'll call that student A. Let's say student A in the first module gets 10 correct and gets routed to the easier path. So on that test, that form, 10 sent you to the easier second module. Student B, let's say, gets 11 correct, and that was the difference on this test. That student got routed to the harder second module. So if student A somehow knew what was going on, they might feel totally offended. Like, wait a minute, you're saying 1 question difference and you've put me on the easier path. You put a ceiling on my score. How unfair of you. Yes, the student is correct that if you get the easier second module, there is now a ceiling on your score. It's going to be the high 600s, maybe 700, vary a bit from test to test. But the reality is the data tell us, we have our own data. 10,000 students have already taken our digital PSAT. The student getting the easier second module would probably get about 12 right. And the score would be, its scaled score would be mid 500s. Student B in the harder module tends to get about 9 right, also scores in the mid 500s. So the majority of the scale can be arrived at through either second module. And I'll just speak bluntly, because we're almost out of time. If you have any business getting the second module, you actually have a shot at scoring high 600s and up. You have that ability, you will absolutely get the second module. It's pretty forgiving. You'd have to have the worst first half of the test of your life to not get the harder second module if that's what you should be getting. You also definitely don't want that harder second module if it's not where you should be. If you have a student who is aiming for a score, say in the low 600s, try to improve from, say, high 400s, you would not want them in the harder second module. I've already heard bad advice about this, Amy. So you're going to see hot takes in tutors' blogs and stuff. The scenario I saw was a student who was aiming for a score of about 650. She was trying to improve from around a 500 and was being told to tank just a little bit in the first module to ensure she got the easier second module, where she was then supposed to run the table. Nonsense, okay? Not helpful advice. You don't want, it's actually bad advice technically. It's also bad advice from a practical perspective. You don't want a 16-year-old trying to hold those thoughts in their head. It wouldn't be helpful even if they could do it. So that's a bit about how the adaptive structure works. One final thing about the scoring. The new digital SAT, for the first time ever, not all questions are worth the same. The current paper test, it's just a raw tally of how many you get right that converts to a scaled score. The new digital SAT uses something more sophisticated called item response theory, which is also what the graduate school admission tests work. It's actually a fairly lightweight version of IRT that the College Board chose to use for this test. But it's pretty heavy duty math. I'll give you a really quick introduction. I mean, really quick. It's using this model with 3 parameters. It could have been more sophisticated with more parameters, but they kept it fairly simple. And the underlying theory is item characteristic curve, which plots the probability that you're getting a question right against the underlying ability being measured. So it's on this ability axis. I'll be brief here. Here's the math. If this is your thing, what's I think helpful to know a little bit about is what is it doing? It is looking at 3 unique parameters of each question. And it's taking into account the effect of random guessing, which is multiple choice. It's taking into account the raw difficulty of each question. Every question is different raw difficulty. But what's I think most interesting is it's looking at this idea of discrimination, not prejudicial behavior, of course, but the idea of differentiation, which is what the tests are trying to do. So imagine a question like this on a test. What would this require of you and what would it say about you? I mean, it wouldn't say very much. Hopefully you know it's not A or B, but whether you know it's C or D is just dumb luck. That's not telling, that's not informing the scale. So on that item characteristic curve, on the model, this question's outcome would look like a straight horizontal blue line. It would provide no discrimination, no differentiation on the ability axis here. It would be useless. You would never see it on the test. Whereas imagine a question that could somehow in one question perfectly discriminate between, let's say, students above and below 600. That might be modeled by this orange line, which doesn't exist in reality, but well-designed questions and the algorithm correctly picking the mix of questions for a given student, you can correctly peg them on the scale out of 800 more efficiently with fewer questions. So that's what IRT is doing behind the scenes. It does tend to scare students because yes, it's true that for the first time ever, you could have 3 students who get the same raw score, get the same number wrong, but get 3 different scores. That is not unfair. It's just the construct that the test is using. The science is pretty solid. This has been something that we've been using in psychrometrics for decades. It is actually not important. All I want you to do is know that if you hear something otherwise, you can feel confident that it's just something like that's interesting trivia, but keep it out of the student's head. We don't want students sitting there during the test thinking, oh no, did I get the easier second module? Or, oh no, is this question really hard? So therefore I should spend more time on it. None of that's knowable or actionable. And a kind of an interesting twist, students who don't get a lot of support, who didn't know anything about the test other than go in and get as many as you can right, would be fine and maybe better off because they wouldn't be distracted by these ideas. So know that it exists and then forget about it in case, unless and until you ever have to explain it. I want to finish up by saying the practice tests are really, really, really helpful. So hopefully your student, if you have a 10th grader, took the practice ACT seriously, try to gear them up for this next one, the practice paper SAT. And the reporting is very, very robust. This is just a screenshot of the online testing environment when they go on to try that. There is a bit of a learning curve, so you want to make sure you're very familiar with the tools. The reporting that we provide, I'll be immodest here. It's the best. We're very, very proud of it. Put a lot of work into it. We show a lot of interesting slices of the data. So, for example, we're showing students something we call similar scores, where we're showing them problem by problem how they did compared to students at the exact same score level. So it reveals, for example, a question that you got wrong that was really out of character for students at your level. It's one you really can and should get right. We need to go after that one. Whereas here's one that you got wrong, but so does everyone else in this range, so it's not going to be the priority. One example. And then on the digital adaptive test, there's so much you can do with the analytics. So we're of course tracking the time a student spends per question, but we're also surfacing for them the average time spent per question by the students who got that question right. So they can see where they underinvested or overinvested in time. Really, really helpful as you try and improve your score. Again, here are the ways that you can reach us and how we can be of assistance. Again, all I want to reiterate here is that we would, of course, love to talk to you about our private tutoring, how we match students with tutors and so forth, or very affordable group classes. But you can come to us for help with diagnostic tests and a consultation on what they all mean without any pressure whatsoever to enroll in our services. We're very good about that. A lot of this comes down to ultimately how well the student and the tutor work together. We cut no corners there. Great people, we're just very proud of and work very closely with, people who we keep for years and years and years. And here is the team of folks that you'd be working with if you come to us for guidance or any actual instruction. Great folks, many of whom I've worked with for 20 plus years. So there's just some names and faces of who is based there in our Marin office. Okay, Amy, let me invite you to rejoin us. You're still there?
I'm
There you
here,
go, she
Adam.
is.
Thank you.
Okay, and then
The-
yeah, are there any questions that we can get into?
The only question that I was saving for you, I was able to answer most of them in the chat, was just
Okay.
whether one of the tests includes more vocabulary than the other.
Interesting. The importance of direct vocab questions went away long time ago. Analogies haven't been on either test for years and years and years. It's an interesting question, Amy. I would say that vocabulary is facility with language has never gone away, but there are fewer questions of late that are just pure, do you know this word? I will say there are signs in the digital SAT that the relevance of vocab is ticking back up. You've only so many ways you can make a question with less material, shorter passage, difficult. One of those ways is your $2 vocab words. What do you do with that? It still is not effective. It has not been for 20 years to prepare for these tests with huge stacks of flashcards. You don't do that. But for the 9th and 10th grade parents on the call, getting the student to just do as much reading as they can pays off big. Maybe I'll give a very, very quick recommendation. If you could get your 9th or 10th grader to once a week carefully read a short piece of writing that you pick, something that you come across in what you read regularly, ideally something that's written at a college level and takes no more than about 5 minutes to read. So something that requires your full attention as an adult as you read it to understand it. Get your kid to read that also and discuss for 5 minutes what it was about. Do this in the car. What was going on? What was the main idea? How was the argument made? Do you agree? What was a weakness of the argument, or what were some stylistic things about the writing you thought were really effective or could be improved? Oh, and any words you didn't know or phrases you didn't understand, let's discuss them back and forth. Do that weekly for a year, and verbal scores won't need compass. And some of you are sitting there thinking, oh, he's hopelessly naive. Didn't he say he has kids? You're right, that did not work on my current first-year college student. But my 10th graders, we're doing it with them, and they're okay with it. They're twins, and they're competitive. So we've made that competitive. Sorry, Amy, I know it's late at night. I gave you a long answer, but vocab in isolation, vocab in isolation isn't worth being concerned about, but everything else I just said.
Okay, great. Another question just came in about when students can do a digital practice SAT through Compass.
Should have mentioned that. At your convenience, at your leisure. So the school staged the most immediately relevant test, the paper versions. The digital test, I will provide, Amy, tomorrow a link that you can send out for MA families to contact us to do that. It's very simple. You could choose to do that in a proctored environment, but a lot of families, students does it at home. The platform basically is the proctor and the timekeeper. And then you'd immediately get a very detailed report. So I would recommend you do that sometime between now and the fall, so you've got all your options in front of you. Unless you already know from the practice test that you've taken, ACT is the test for me, then maybe you don't bother, but otherwise just follow up on the link that we'll be sending you.
Great. No other questions are in the chat, Adam. I think you must have answered all.
That's it. Okay.
Folks, just know that if you do have a question that comes up after the fact, feel free to email me. And if I can't answer it directly, I'll reach out to Adam. But I was pretty good at answering most of them in the chat as we went along the way. So, Adam, thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
Your lens on what's going on. It's a difficult, moving quicksand right now with everything. So we really appreciate your advice.
It's been my pleasure, Amy. Thank you for having me, and just wish you all the best. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Good night.